Hello, everyone. Welcome and good evening, and thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Claire, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I'm very pleased to introduce this virtual event with Erika Hayasaki, who is here with her new book, Somewhere Sisters, a story of adoption, identity, and the meaning of family. She'll be in conversation with Indigo Willing. Through virtual events like tonight's, Harvard Bookstore continues to bring authors and their work to our community and our digital community. Thank you for joining us tonight in support of our authors and the incredible staff of booksellers at Harvard Bookstore. We sincerely appreciate your support now and always. We've had a very busy fall full of events, and it is not over yet. Our calendar appears on our website at harvard.com/events, where you can also sign up for our email newsletter and even browse our shelves from home. After the introduction, I will drop a link in the chat to order Somewhere Sisters. Your purchases make this virtual author series possible, and now more than ever, support the future of a landmark independent bookstore. This evening's event will include some time for your questions. If you have a question for our speakers at any time during the talk tonight, you can go to the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get through as many as time allows. The event will have closed captioning available. Depending on the version of Zoom you're using, you may need to enable captions yourself by clicking the closed caption live transcript button on your screen. And finally, as you might have experienced in virtual gatherings over the past few years, technical issues might arise. If they do, we'll do our best to resolve them quickly, and we thank you for your patience and understanding. Erika Hayasaki is a journalist, author, and professor of literary journalism at UC Irvine. Formerly the national correspondent for the LA Times, you may also be familiar with her work that has appeared in the New York Times Magazine, The Atlantic, Wired, and the Best American Science and Nature Writing, among others. She's been recognized by the American Association of Sunday and Feature Editors, the Society for Features Journalism, and the American Society of Newspaper Editors. Her first book was the acclaimed The Death Class. She'll be in conversation this evening with Dr. Indigo Willing. Dr. Willing is a sociologist whose work is focused on creating bridges between academia and community sectors. She's also the founder of the Adopted Vietnamese International community, known as AVI, which runs various initiatives to keep adopted Vietnamese feeling connected with their history and with one another. In 1998, twin girls were born in Vietnam. One was brought up by her aunt in Vietnam. The other was adopted by a family in Chicago. In this riveting new book, Erika delves into both girls' lives and the lives of their families. It's an intimate look at what it means to grow up and the complicated history of adoption between the US and Vietnam. Kirkus says, Hayasaki places the girls' experiences in the context of decades of transracial and transnational adoptions, creating an engaging portrait of intersected lives. And BuzzFeed has named it one of their top books of the month, saying it's a heart-wrenching tale told with compassion. And so now I'm pleased to turn things over to tonight's speakers, Erika and Indigo. The virtual podium is yours.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'll let you go first, Indigo. And
okay. So thank you so much, Claire and Harvard Bookstore, and of course, Erika Hayasaki for this invitation. My name is Dr. Indigo Willing. I am on the land of the Yugara and Turrbal peoples in Mianjin, Brisbane, Australia. My background is that I was in an orphanage in Vietnam and adopted to the West, and that's how I met Erika, writing this remarkable book. So I'll throw it over to you, Erika.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be in conversation with you. We first met over Zoom, and we've never actually been in person over all these years. But I am a journalist, as you all know, and I spent about 5 years working on this project. And when I started out, it began as a project that was, thinking about twins separated and reunited. I am the mother of twins, and I've researched twin science. I was connected to a professor, Nancy Segal, who studies twins, is kind of the premier twin researcher in the world. And I had written some stories around epigenetics and twins, and she introduced me to various twins around the country. And I was particularly drawn to Isabella and Hat. They, at that point, were already living together in the United States, but had spent much of their lives apart. So one sister living in Vietnam and the other being raised in a suburb of Chicago, not far from where I grew up in Illinois. And initially I was drawn to these stories from this perspective of twins, but also from the perspective of being Asian American and growing up in this town that was not so far from where one of the twins grew up, and experiencing different encounters with racism, which I know Indigo has also experienced. And but I didn't know a lot about adoption, and that as a journalist, sometimes you enter into stories that, I write about science and often don't know it's entirely new to me. And so I had this opportunity to engage with these scholars and activists and voices around adoption who have been doing this work for decades, and really had a chance to delve into that work. So I was so grateful to be able to interview people like Indigo and others in the book to set the context of this story that is a narrative about this family, but really also brings up these very important discussions around transnational, intercountry, and transracial adoption, and also the legacy of twin science and research. So go ahead, Indigo. Do you want to talk about?
Yeah, there's just so much going on, isn't there, with this this story. In sociology, we have archetypes or typologies of the way that we relate to people, and one of my favorites is the storyteller. So you have people like the joker, people that are always telling you jokes to communicate to you. You have the sort of the advocate that's always sort of telling you about fairness and justice. And then you have the storytellers, which are probably one of the most valuable people, specifically to communicate things that we observe, we feel, but we don't know how to articulate ourselves sometimes. Because I am from a community of adoptees, and we have people with PhDs, we have people with journalism backgrounds, we have some brilliant authors as well. But sometimes it's really nice to also share the pain and the stories that we carry with others that we feel connections with. And just in your bio that you introduced then, growing up in Illinois as an Asian American, really touches me every time I hear it, because while we haven't met, we've had a few chats. And I think about, like, for us in Australia, at least, like Illinois is the Blues Brothers, it's like this really American, this town with concrete and cars and just so much going on that's very American. And then to think about this transposition of Vietnamese children there from Vietnam, and your book beautifully covers that. You can hear the smells, you can hear the motorbikes, you can almost feel the mosquitoes and hear the lizards. It's like very, very different kind of backgrounds, that very, very different worlds that are brought together through adoption. And it's very hard to find people that really can feel and breathe that and understand what an enormous transposition and what an enormous journey that is for the children. And yet you've done such a beautiful job with that. So I really just wanted to make sure that people knew that I really feel a connection with the Asian American experience, and so do a lot of adoptees. And to have your storytelling be a part of that is actually something very powerful. So
thank you. I love that. I just want to, I appreciate that so much. And I think about, when you're a journalist, you're a storyteller, you're capturing other people's stories. I don't often write about myself, although I have, and this story has in some ways given me courage to do more of that. But because I had these overlapping kind of themes happening with the sisters in the book that I've experienced in my own life. But as a journalist, to have the scenes from Vietnam come alive and the scenes from Illinois, and also to have a lot of these events, just to be clear, happened, years before I ever entered into the picture. So, the sisters are young women now, graduated from college in their mid-20s, and they were reunited when they were 13. So what the approach I did with them is to reconstruct their memories and reconstruct scenes from other people that I interviewed, and to visit the places. So I was able to travel to Vietnam and visit the orphanage, for example, or the village where I grew up. And but that's like a very specific kind of journalism that it's very hard because you can't be there. So it's great that people can feel some of that coming off the page. So thank you for that. And Indigo, I like one thing I wanted to do is read like a little passage that includes some work from you, because I really want to bring your work into the discussion. And so is that okay to do?
Yeah, please.
Oh, okay, cool. I'm going to pull it up on my screen because I think this is a good launching point for some of the discussion that we could have today around some of the themes of the book. And so this is a chapter called Fairy Tales. It's chapter 17. And I'll just start reading a little bit of it. Once upon a time in ancient Vietnam, a dragon king from the water, Loc Long Quan, had a love affair with a fairy princess from the land, Oka. It is said that their brief union produced 100 eggs, which hatched into the first Vietnamese children, wrote Indigo Willing, who studied the mythological story while earning her PhD in sociology at the University of Queensland. One day, Loc Long Quan told Okao, I am descended from dragons, you from fairies. We are as incompatible as water is with fire, so we cannot continue in harmony. The lovers parted, and each took half of their 100 children with them. Despite their yearning to be together, it was their fate. It's such a beautiful story, how they fell in love in the heavens, Willing told me during a Zoom interview, the first year of COVID. But they had to separate, so the king went down to the ocean and the fairy went up to the mountains, and that's the story of why the North and South and the Vietnamese people are continually apart. This story represents a kind of collective longing for unity among Vietnamese people and an acceptance of what it is meant to be. But in her research, Willing grew particularly interested in another strand of this legend, not often recounted. In some versions, as she learned, it turned out a few of the fairy princess's eggs had accidentally been left behind. As the tale goes, a European king and queen discovered the babies after the eggs hatched. Thinking they were abandoned, the royal couple decided to take the infants back to their own soil and raise them, Willing wrote in a 2004 article in the Michigan Quarterly Review. Even though they looked different from the people in their land, the children, though loved, felt rejected by society because of their foreign status and wondered where they came from. As a baby, Willing was classified as an orphan, adopted from Vietnam in 1972 and raised by a family a white family in an Australian suburb. To her, these fictional children of Loc Long Quan and Ao Cao represented the experiences of thousands of Vietnamese children who were adopted overseas, including many during the era of the war. As the adopted Vietnamese began to mature, she wrote, they would come to feel curious about their birth country and the people they left behind. But in real life, the process of searching rarely leads to biological families, she explained. And when reunions do happen, they are often fraught with pain and confusion. So that is a passage from the book, and it highlights some of your work, Indigo, but I thought, maybe do you want to add to that conversation at all, maybe around the questions of myth and fantasy, and also these ideas of reunion that we have in mainstream culture, which I certainly grew up with. And it took a lot of me learning this to understand these myths and fantasies and coming across the work of so many adoptees like yourself.
Of course. So thank you so much for including that essay that I wrote on fairy tales to the diaspora in your book. It's a remarkable book because it has it's not necessarily linear. It weaves almost like a dream through the stories of the twins that we'll talk about soon and their sister as well. These 3 Vietnamese girls that were adopted overseas to America and removed from, families of very different circumstances, very different culture, very different socioeconomic situations as well. And I think that, there's a lot of mythology in adoption that features in a lot of Hollywood movies. It's, from a lot of classics from Oliver Twist onwards. there's always like a fairy tale element of the child from rags to riches. So you have the waif, you have the abandoned child who is delivered like pennies from heaven into a more wealthier family. And I guess the fairy tale is always that those children live happily ever after. And what I wanted to do is complicate that myth, because I started meeting other adoptees and of course, reflecting on my own lived experiences of just trying to struggle with identity and grief and all that sorts of other things. And it isn't a fairy tale in the typical sense that there's just a linear happy ending. You know, again, it's like your book, it's sort of a mixture, it's a montage of feelings and emotions and ups and downs. And, it can be very dreamlike, it can be very sad. I often live through my dreams. I dream of my Vietnamese family often. And, then I wake up and I have to come to terms with a kind of grief that I can't articulate. And I sort of realize that there's a lot of others that feel this way. So drawing on Vietnamese mythology was really a way, firstly, to connect with the Vietnamese culture that I was removed from because of the war. So adoptees are like forced migrants. They're basically from the refugee generation if we're talking about the war adoptions. And then after that, they're a very particular type of migrant group that didn't, as babies and children, choose to migrate. There is a sense of forced migration there, even though it's done within the realm of a family and with the intention of, ensuring that that child has safety, shelter, and so on. But yeah, definitely the Vietnamese mythology of the fairy and the dragon falling in love, having children, and having to separate really resonated with me. It's like this eternal longing for knowing that you have other relatives out there and knowing that you coexist in the universe, but not being able to be raised together. Really just felt to me like it's reflected, it was almost like a mirror onto adoption. And then the second part of the legend about finding the abandoned eggs and thinking that the children were abandoned is, again, very reminiscent of what happens to the birth mothers or the first mothers of the Vietnamese. They're in circumstances without much autonomy, without much agency. Often, societally, there might be things that, separate them from their children, conflict, wars, many, many things that we can think about, colonialism. So much went on during the war of Vietnamese adoptions. That idea that these children were just sort of blank slates waiting there with no history was a sort of a mythology that is still, I think, perpetuated in many adoptions today that we know is not true. So understanding there are many sides to adoption, including the child's or the adoptee's journey, the adoptive parents' journey, the first parents and their Vietnamese family's journey in this strange world of separation, renewal, reconstruction. So yeah, the mythology is just a very sort of spiritual, I guess, or soulful way to try and make some sense of what happened, or at least see it outside of how you're feeling, see it and externalize it for yourself and others.
Yeah, and I thought that as I was reading your work and came across your work and many discussions around myth and fantasy red thread narratives, for example, I also came to understand how complicated it would be to do this book because there were so many perspectives that I wanted to represent, and it was important to have the people, because people want to read about people. They want to read about human experiences. They want to identify with people in your book, your characters, your real life characters, and that would be in this book, obviously the sisters, but also their constellations of family members, from first families to adoptive families to grandmothers, and also the social context, which is what I was able to gain through this research. I think about the character dimension and the social dimension of the story, which is how did we get here? What is the history here? What are the social ramifications? What are the issues that we can discuss and that are still being discussed now? Why does this matter right now? It still is incredibly important to talk. We need to keep having conversations around adoption in the US. We certainly are at a moment where, there have been calls for people to say adoption may be the answer to the end of Roe versus Wade, which, many adoptees have said, hold on, wait a minute, let's stop these conversations right now and discuss these complicated realities and painful realities sometimes around adoption. And then, of course, there's like the third dimension for me, which is always the human condition dimension, which is like these big questions around fate and destiny, which you get at also, that I feel are important. These questions are unanswerable sometimes to us, like how we become who we are, how, you know, why, you know, the bigger themes that we find in literature that are sometimes kind of existential. And in the book, it's a lot about fate and destiny too. And so those the braiding of all of that also made, like you said, the book not necessarily linear. The stories, as you say, are not, right?
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, it's so well put together. It's a beautiful voyage to start with the stories that you start with, it intercut with the voices of the girls as well, and then flashbacks, and then we move between countries, we jump in time to first meetings, to when are we going to have a proper reunion in person, the difficulties of the modern age of, like, you know, meeting birth families through technology. All sorts of things are really interestingly covered in this book. And I was kind of actually wondering, certainly as a mother now, I'm a mother, and thinking of adoption, it really hits hard to think of being separated from my child. To me, that's, you know, like 1,000 things goes through your head thinking about that. And because you're a mother and you also write about twins, I was wondering, yeah, what was is that what drew you to the adoptee story, as you as a mother, or what drew you to writing about Isabella and then also Olivia?
I think perhaps the mother angle was part of it. Certainly, being a mother of twins, it made me think about twins. Well, I've always thought about twins actually, but I didn't know I was going to have twins, so that was a surprise. And then the thing about being a journalist is you can kind of just follow wherever your life takes you and write about those questions that you have, right? But I do think, you know, so certainly the idea of what it would mean to be separated lingered with me and made me think about that. And also, you know, the ideas or the questions around identity, I think, whether it's identity of do our genes make us who we are, or does the environment make us who we are? So that's certainly like the question that's always been within twin studies and also adoption studies. You know, there's been this sort of historic back and forth between it's genes or it's the environment, it's nature, it's nurture, it's nature, it's nurture. And, you know, honestly, we understand that there's an interplay between the environment and your genes, you know, and so it's much more complicated. And then, of course, the identity questions around race, you know, I think what I related to in my interviews is that feeling of otherness, like never being enough of an Asian American person, or being sort of just lost and confused in a place where you just didn't necessarily always fit in, and being bullied and kind of navigating that identity at these very tender ages. For me, it was also 13 and earlier and after too, but those were sort of the key areas. I don't know, was it for you as well? Maybe you could talk too a little bit about your own experiences with navigating identity. And I don't know if you feel comfortable with that, but talk a little bit about it in the book.
It's a good connecting question, and it's one of the, I think it's one of the reasons I kind of wrote it was such an honor to be a part of this book. It's one of the highlights of my careers, really, because not many Asian Americans reach out to adopted Asian diasporas. It's kind of like we grow up separately almost, and we have so much in common, but we don't get those opportunities to share. And I think probably the reason for that is that Asian adoptees, and you cover it well in your book with the story of Olivia in particular, want to just fit in. They don't want to be a special case of, you know, they don't want to be a special charity case. They don't want to be like a, you know, a diversity mascot. They just want to grow up as any other young person would. But this is where the fairy tale gets very complicated in that they're growing up as a minority, not just in society and often in their own schools, but also in the family as well. So when they are confronted with racism, for example, if somebody calls them Ching Chong Chinaman or whatever, somebody yelled that at me and my friend the other day when we were just skateboarding and we were coming home from the skate park. And these two guys just sort of, went past, they're always yelling out of cars or vehicles. And they said, oh, hey, ching chong to us. And like, my friend's like, that's some old ass racism. Like, like at least come up with some new material. And as an adult now, they kind of brush that off a little bit, like, okay. And then maybe 2 years ago, when people were calling us coronavirus and calling out COVID at us and spitting at us, same thing. It's like, oof, this is okay. I can live through this. But it's only that resilience is from knowing that at childhood, we confronted that racism pretty much alone. So, around 5 is the age that most social researchers say that we notice race and start becoming conscious of, belonging to different categories, because we start school and that's when we start interacting with adults as well, and beyond our family unit. And yeah, at a 5-year-old, trying to come to terms with being that much of an outsider and being denigrated because of your looks and the color of your skin, and you can't wash it off. And then people in your family might try and empathize with you, but your key role models haven't experienced that. So they don't have that, 100% empathy. And sometimes even well-meaningly say the wrong things, like, oh, I got in trouble because I wore glasses at school or something. Like, it's kind of like just trying to feel you can survive certain things is really, really hard. So I felt like there's probably a lot of people of color, First Nations people, Black people, Asian people that all experience this as children, mostly with peers that can understand that and build some sort of collective response and resilience together. But adoptees don't do that normally. They're just trying to fit in, and that doesn't really coexist always, or is always encouraged, or is always just seems normal to do that. So having these conversations with other Asians that aren't adopted is really, really important, because I mentioned before that all the pain and longing and grief in adoption, I reached out to mythologies and fairy tales and great literature in Vietnamese culture. I mean, another way to sort of deal with when we're marginalized is feeling politicized and having collective power, or just externalizing it and saying the problem's not me as this 5-year-old child, or for the girls here as 13-year-olds in high school being bullied for looking different. The power to help through that is to realize that there is a whole community that has built resilience around these issues. They are not nice, but they're felt by others. So yeah, it's definitely been a part of my growing up, and it's still part of my adulthood, dealing with that otherness. And yeah, it's what sort of drew me to doing my work with adoptees, because it is it can be quite a unusual experience to experience loss of family, trying to work out who you are and all those things alone. But we're not alone. We have quite a lot of other adoptees out there on the internet. There are, literally thousands of Vietnamese adoptees now as well that are older. So connecting generations that are out there, and just sort of building a hub. AVI really is just like a central hub. It's mainly a Facebook group now. It has, around 1,000 people, but people post weekly just saying, I'm looking for my parents, or I just want to get a DNA test, or I just feel really lonely and I grew up wondering how to write my name in Vietnamese and I still can't say it right. Like, does anyone else experience that? Like these things that can make us feel very, very much alone and feel some sort of weight that we didn't buy ourselves. We have to carry it though. Feeling that together is very, very comforting and healing. And, it's remarkable. I feel for the generations of Korean adoptees that didn't have that, didn't have the internet, just couldn't jump online and find others. So yeah, basically bringing together, adoption brings together issues of diasporas and migrants, your relationship as well as a settler in a colonial nation as well, and how we relate to First Nations people coming from a colonized country, our experiences of racism, but also just experiences of being people that just want to fit in and, be proud of our culture, but also proud of the people that we are in the new spaces that we go to. That's universal. So it covers quite a lot of things. And I find that, there's really interesting commentary that adoptees can project back to other people about gender, race, migration, families, what it is to create a family and feel like a family without blood ties. All these things are, really can connect across communities. And I think that your book has a lot for people outside of people that just want to know about Adoption Vietnam. It really just touches on ideas of family, listening to teenagers and their needs. And yeah, actually that brings me to another question really, is that I was wondering, at least for adoptees, there's a conversation of whether searching for our birth parents should be done on our behalf or whether we should do it ourselves. And your book really explores that. Maybe you could just speak about that topic of reunion and searching and what you found in your book.
Yeah, so we have this idea also of reunion that is common on television, and there's a lot of reunion shows, and even twins being reunited like live on, which I have a scene, on Good Morning America or something, and always, I don't know if you've seen those, but that feels incredibly uncomfortable to watch these moments, but yet people are drawn in, right? Obviously, the idea of reunion, even with this story, it's immediately like, well, how did they find each other? How did that happen? What is that like? I think what I appreciated as I got to know the story of the sisters is that their story in many ways like breaks a lot of the tropes that we might be familiar with, like, oh, we think reunion happily ever after, but actually reunion was, you can read about it, but it was not the most comfortable. And actually what I've come to understand, there's a lot of pain with reunion, a lot of complications with birth families, and everybody has their own story with that in the book. I was able to interview Linnell Long, who I know you work with as well, who also put this into context, and also psychologists explaining, that choice should be up to the adoptee, right? And I think in this particular book, choices were happening and decisions were being made on behalf of the sisters who were younger, right? And that again raises like complicated questions and emotions, I think, when people will read that. And so much like the assumptions we have maybe been taught about adoption, the story beginning, as you said, with like in a lot of movies with the act of adopting and like erasing the birth and first families, that's one idea that we've come to know. And same with twins, like we seem to think that twins are all alike and they have the same genes, so isn't it cool that they look alike and talk, and they're actually, these twins are not 100% alike, and they're very much individuals, very different, and have similar aspects to them as well. But same with reunion, like we watch these shows on reunion or hear about reunions, and reunion can actually come with a lot more. And maybe you can talk about that too. You do write about it as well, and you've certainly experienced that with different adoptees you talk to as well. But reunion is not the fairy tale, from what I have learned and tried to address too. Maybe you want to talk about that a little too, Indigo?
Yeah, I think I think the popular mythology that is laced and weaved into adoption stories, it's really more like our lives are like a magic realist novel. It's like all the twists and turns of an Isabella Allende novel, where there's like tragedy, there's like really strange plot twists, there's like unknown people that all of a sudden pop up and are very eccentric, and they're a big part of that person's life. And it's there's just so many different ways to think about the reunion story, whether it's through the translators, it's through the adoption agencies, obviously the first families, the adoptive families, just bystanders and friends at all. All we're needed is support and as ways to make this connection as smooth as possible, because it is a big thing, and it can be done ethically, it can be done unethically, it can be done spontaneously, it can be done with a lot of planning, but whichever way it's done, it's not a fairy tale book. It's not like you can just bring people together from completely different backgrounds, maybe don't even speak the same language. There's a lot of loss and pain, and there's a lot of hurt. There's a lot of projections about what people expect from each other that need to be played out very sensitively, with a lot of compassion, a lot of understanding, and a lot of patience. And that's not normally discussed even in adoption literature by, adoptive parents that might write about their children's experiences, or, you might read it on CNN or something. So we really need people to do more research in the area of reunions. We really appreciate when people like yourself write about those experiences, and that you don't paint it as this sort of simple, easily fixed puzzle picture or something. Like, there's nuance, there's patience, there's kindness, but a really, committed gaze, a look into what happens when people reunite after adoption. So, they'll have to read the book, I guess, to sort of see some of the things that we're talking about now. But it really is, I think even in like any celebrations in America, whatever your religion is, if you or not, and you get together at, like, say, a December party or something, like a birthday or a funeral, like when you meet family that you even know it's complicated and everyone's on their best behavior. So yeah, I mean, you can imagine how big a reunion with birth family is. But one of the things I really love about your book is that it engages with the adoptee community as multifaceted, and as having our own storytellers and having our own experts as well. So there are wonderful people like Susan Ito, Kim Noonan, who you're going to speak to. You quote people like Kim Park Nelson, who's one of the leading Korean adoptee researchers on adoption, and looking at the way the media has portrayed adoptions in very simplistic ways, and how that can be really harmful to the actual complex journey it is for everybody, including adoptees, adoptive parents, first families, and so on. Linnell Long, who is the founder of ICAV, who I met way back in the 90s when we were first exploring adoption journeys. Her work is quite amazing. It's very rights-based focused on adoptees. So, looking at will governments help us get access to our birth records? Will they help pay for us to, get those records, maybe have counseling? What services can we use that already exist that we can bring adoptees into using that can help our journeys? She's also got an extensive website with lots of resources on mental health and well-being, which is incredibly important for our community. As we follow the girls' journeys in this book, you can see that they go through more than your average teenager, more than you would want your average teenager to have to think about, the type of things that they go, like they've already got the bullying and everything else, and the racism, but on top of that, then they have this weight of, how am I going to be who people want me to be as a new sister, a new daughter, an adoptive sister, whatever. It's a lot of things going on for them. So Linnell has some really great resources on her website on mental health, well-being, post-adoption resources, and really serious things as well. So just like a quick trigger warning, she gives stuff on suicide prevention, because I think part of your book you sort of notice is that some of the adoptee populations are higher percentage go through various traumas that manifest and show themselves in various ways. And then of course your book's wonderful, and it touches on the adoptee rights for citizenship as well. So on top of everything else that we've spoken about, we've always got lingering over us the fact that we can be deported if our paperwork wasn't worked out when we were adopted, and that we're not automatically in the past, prior to a particular year, citizens, even if we're adopted. So, it's really important to look at adoptees, not just this distinct part of the migration and diaspora and Asians, but having these interconnections with rights for Asian Americans, for Latinx, for, various populations, these sort of conversations around citizenship, racism, detainment, migration as well. Can you actually talk a bit about that? Because I feel that's important.
I mean, I wanted to highlight the work Rebecca Kinney, who was able to connect, some of these conversations in the book to, histories of Asian American exclusion, right, and immigrant narratives in the U.S., and then also adoptees for justice, because there is a moment in the book where the sisters who were adopted into the U.S. realize they're not citizens, and again, you can read all this, but that opens up a whole discussion about why is that you've been here 18 years and you're now realizing, and then there is this really painful history associated with that, not just in the US, but in recent years with people who are adoptees being deported and suicides. So that becomes something that's in the book. It's part of the story, but also the experts like I would say Adoptees for Justice and Linnell Long and others who talked about some of these issues. It became so important to kind of connect. Again, so this is not a narrative that's just a personal story. It brings in that social context and that history and the why are we discussing this now? Why is this still important now? All of that is kind of interwoven into the narrative, which makes it this multi-dimensional kind of project. And through the writing of it, again, it was a long journey and lots of years of interviews, and also just structure was challenging. But I would say that one resource that I turned to after writing different drafts was from a journalistic perspective, a journalist named Cynthia Dirks, who has something called the Power Narrative Edit, and she talks about examining your reporting after you've done it and maybe written your drafts and thinking about the power within, who holds the power within a story. As a storyteller, I hold a tremendous amount of power. And so it's important to me to, make sure that the people in the story, particularly the sisters who were, not empowered in many ways, to feel empowered in telling their stories, right? And also to have the voices of different communities represented, so that it's not, so that it's more balanced and weighted, so that that you're not giving so much voice to the power structure, the people with it, the most power in the story. So that was helpful for me in kind of thinking through what to add and structure. But again, it's not simple because you have to get this journalistic voice in with the narrative voice. That's a little challenging because it's it's a different voice, so that becomes hard. Right.
I'm going to throw some of the Q&A over to you in a second, but I just wanted to sort of, somebody asked about resources out there. So the Intercountry Adoptee Perspectives Voices ICAV is on the internet on Facebook. So just look up ICAV and you can find Linnell's group. For Adopted Vietnamese International, we have archived a lot of the resources that we have on the internet on the website, but we keep the Facebook private and for adoptee voices, so other people can join and observe, but we reserve that space just for Vietnamese adoptees to speak, because we were finding that they would share their story and then people would, sort of ask questions that were distracting or maybe sometimes a bit dismissive, and we just wanted to guard that space for what we discuss. And then I just want to shout out to Jade Wexler, who is also quoted in Erika's book, who did her honours thesis on Vietnamese adoptees, which is a remarkable work. And she has a lot of insights as well. And just keep an eye out for anthologies and collections by transnational adoptees out there. There's one published with Jenny Wills and Tobias Hubinette, with myself, has a whole collection of adoptees writing about research, including Kim Park Nelson. There's people like Jae-Ran Kim. There's a really strong body of literature out there about adoption by adoptees. And then we have collaborative or investigative works like Erika's as well that are really helpful in bringing out even more of the stories. So Erika, can you see the Q&A? Because somebody's got a really interesting question for you about what stories you left out.
I cannot see the Q&A. But just real quick on the resources, in the back of the book also there's a long bibliography with a lot of resources that I wanted to share as well. And also thank you for shouting out Jade
So
Wexler, a
the
reader.
question is, given how many hours of recording to you, Erika, you must have made, imagine that some of the topics or stories had to be left out. Is there anything, an anecdote or a study that you had to take out of the final draft?
I mean, I think, yeah, well, I always write too long and then end up cutting a lot. So that's just inevitable with the way I do stories. It's often like a vomit draft and it's like so long and then you got to get it to a manageable length. I would say that this book focuses on the women largely, and it's not all the women. It's the sisters that are the ones that I was able to really have this access and connection with. And then, of course, the various mothers in the book. And then there are grandmothers also, but lightly, and also that access is different because I had to interview through interpreters, and so it wasn't the same kind of level of access, and that changes how maybe you might read their characters with, there's depth there, but not necessarily the depth that you get with the sisters. And certainly there's like all the family members that are part of the adopted family, and then the first family movie, and there's sisters and aunties and like lots of people who have incredible stories that I did not get to really include all of that in there because there was already a lot, and the fathers, there's the fathers too. I did not get to interview the first father, but there is a story of when she met him, which again did not go well for her, and so that's reconstructed through her memories, but she never saw him again. But that's a good question.
I think that answers it. I'm just going to see, there's another one. You mentioned, this is from an anonymous attendee, you mentioned that the reunion was arranged on her and Loan's behalf. Whose actions drove the process? Is it more common for reunions to be brought about that way, or for transnational adoptees to seek out their birth families themselves? And does it vary by generations? So who initiated the reunion, and how common is it?
So the adoptive mother was the one who really made this reunion happen. And I think it was her realizing that there was a twin out there. That's how it started. And making, these efforts to find this twin. And that's how that came together. I would love for you to speak to this, Indigo, because this is not how it happens for everybody. And certainly every reunion story is, and every adoptee story is totally a different story. There's not one way. But do you want to talk about that kind of more general question that was about reunion?
I could probably do it in a sort of non-researcher sense, just as a lived experience way. In that, definitely for Vietnamese adoptees from the war, they've been trying to search for quite a number of years, but it became more of an urge in their late 20s when they had finished basically their high school. They've survived that. Maybe for some people, they've gone into their first jobs and moved out of home, moved away from their adoptive parents, maybe gone to college, whatever their life choices and opportunities were. I think they've had some distance from their adoptive parents' home to make that decision in the past. And also the technology. So now we can take DNA tests through things like Family Finder or whatever the companies are. A wonderful person called Trista Goldberg, who's a Vietnamese adoptee, also started a DNA reunion project to get as many birth mothers or first mothers that can give their DNA. So from the Vietnamese side, there's not a large number of women giving their DNA, and we can again question the privacy of everything of DNA, but it has been pretty crucial in some cases to confirm that people are related. There's been a few false reunions, so the DNA tests have been pretty important in some ways to get that confirmed, because war records are very messy and many other things came into play. But I think for younger generations, often the adoptive parents even have the choice to have like not an open adoption necessarily, that's kind of rare still, but be in contact with the first family. Some of them are like transnational families now, so adoptive parents send remittances to the birth parents' families as well, and the children keep in contact with their family, and that itself is kind of, can play out in different ways. It can be good, it can be bad, it can, be many things. But I feel that the reunions, from what I can tell now, are done a lot earlier and by the parents. And if we move back towards the Vietnamese adoptees, I've definitely met Vietnamese adoptees whose parents have hidden contact with the birth family, and that's really affected them badly. So if there is some sort of way to be truthful in adoptions, I feel that's probably the best policy. The amount of pain it's caused a lot of adoptees, knowing that their adoptive families did not connect them with the birth family when they had letters or information, has been very sort of, sad and painful process. So we're yet to know if it's a good thing that the adoptive parents instigate these searches for their children in some ways, but in other ways, it could be an international obligation in some circumstances. So I feel that's part of adoption, that truthfulness about it. And then what really counts the most is the resources to help people through that. That may not answer the question entirely, but that's just from some lived experience running Adopted Vietnamese International and just observing how my communities navigated that. So I don't think there are any other questions. Erika, are there any final thoughts about the book that you wanted to share with the audience?
Well, I just hope that, I appreciate like all of the people who participated in the project, because it's really not easy to share your life sometimes with a journalist, or to trust a journalist to tell a story. And there's a lot, I take that really seriously. And so I'm so appreciative of all the people who shared their work, their stories, their perspectives to make this book what it is, which is it's a complex story that I hope people will feel moved by, but also learn something. Yeah,
it is. I just wanted to say that as well as reading your book, there's many thousands of stories of Vietnamese adoptees out there, and it's really great when people listen to our community. There's people like Adam Chow, who brought out an Adopted Vietnamese anthology of the Vietnamese adoptees' experiences, which people can explore again. And it's capturing people from different ages, different genders, different sexualities, different class backgrounds. And, we're not all going to have the same story, but I think that there's just some real connecting points between what the Vietnamese older generations are saying and what your book covers, Erika, that I really just want people to commit to understanding adoption as much more complicated than the fairy tale. And your book has done a really good job of opening up the windows again to have a look onto that. So I encourage people to read about us.
Thank you. And your work as well, which is in the bibliography and cited, and will also be shared more. I think your original paper, I know you shared it on Twitter today, so I would encourage people to read the essay that you wrote as well on the fairy tales.
Thank you. And thank you to the Q&A and everyone out there asking questions as well. Hi, Claire.
Hello. Thank you, Erika and Indigo, for that wonderful and just deeply compassionate conversation that I thought was great, and I know our audience did too. And I also want to thank everyone out there in virtual land for spending your evening with us. You can learn more about and purchase Erika's book via the link in the chat or on harvard.com. And on behalf of Harvard Bookstore in Cambridge, Massachusetts, have a wonderful night, keep reading, and please be well.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.